The year was 1883. The sun in this part of the territory didn't just shine, it judged. It bleached the very soul out of the land, leaving behind the palette of rust-colored rock, skeletal mesquite, and the shimmering, heat-distorted air that promised mirages but delivered only thirst. Declan O'Malley knew the sun well. It was the first thing that greeted him when he crawled from his dusty mine shaft, and the last thing that seared the back of his neck before he descended back into the cool, silent darkness. Darkness and silence were what he had come for. The silver he chipped from the unforgiving rock was just an excuse to be here, in a place where a man's history could be burned away by the heat and his sins buried under a landslide of anonymous days. He was a big man, built not with the lean grace of a gunfighter, but with the dense, powerful muscle of a man who worked the earth. His hands were calloused and permanently stained, his knuckles scarred from labor and the occasional brawl his Irish temper couldn't avoid. Back in the Pennsylvania coal fields, those hands had failed to save his wife and child from a collapsed mine he was told was safe. That failure was a ghost that sat on his shoulders, heavier than any load of ore. So he ran west to a place so harsh it felt like a fitting penance. Here, minding his own business was not just a preference, it was a survival strategy. Further south, in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, where the air was a fraction cooler, a woman named Citlali moved with quiet reverence that seemed to defy the brutal landscape. She was a healer, a curandera, and her hands, unlike Declan's, were instruments of mending, not breaking. She gathered ocotillo blossoms and ground sacred datura root, her knowledge passed down from her mother, a Mexican woman who had loved a Chiricahua warrior. Citlali was a product of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Her husband Cale was a warrior, committed to the ways of his people, a path that often took him away on hunts and raids, leaving her to bridge the gaps of her own identity. She served the forgotten people in the borderlands, the poor Mexican families, the outcast natives, the desperate whites who had nowhere else to turn when sickness came. Her life was a delicate balance, a tightrope walk over a canyon of prejudice, and on this day the rope was about to snap. She was returning to the small, hidden settlement she called home, her satchel filled with herbs, when three riders emerged from the shimmering heat. They weren't soldiers or prospectors, they were scavengers, men who fed on the weakness of others. Their leader, a man with a stained duster and cruel, empty eyes, rode his horse to block her path. His name was Silas, and his reputation was a stain upon the territory. "Well now," he drawled, his voice a dry rasp, "look what we have here. A pretty little flower, all alone in the desert." His men chuckled, circling her like coyotes. Declan saw it all from the ridge above. He was heading for the meager settlement of Tombstone for supplies, his mule laden with just enough silver to buy flour, salt, and whiskey. He should have kept walking. It wasn't his fight. This land had taught him that lesson in blood. His own past screamed at him to turn away. He could still see the collapsed timber, hear the silence where there should have been screams. But then he saw the woman's face. She didn't cry out. She stood her ground, her chin lifted, a silent defiance in her dark eyes that reminded him so fiercely of his wife, Anya. Something in him, a piece he thought long dead and buried, cracked open. The ghost on his shoulders shifted, no longer a weight of shame, but a hot spur of fury. He didn't think, he acted. With a roar that ripped from his very soul, he slid down the scree slope, his heavy pickaxe handle gripped tight in one hand. He wasn't a gunslinger, but he was a force of nature. He moved with the momentum of a runaway ore cart, smashing into the first bandit and sending him sprawling from his horse. Silas cursed, drawing his pistol, but he was too close, a whirlwind of desperation and rage. He swung the pickaxe handle, a tool meant for rock, and it met the man's arm with a sickening crack. The pistol clattered to the dust. The third man, seeing the feral look in Declan's eyes, hesitated. It was all the opening Declan needed. He drove his shoulder into the man's horse, a brutal, unorthodox move that sent horse and rider tumbling. Silas, clutching his broken arm, stared at Declan with pure hatred. "You'll regret this, Irish," he spat, blood dripping from his lip. "I'll find you, and I'll find her, and we'll finish this." He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, his men following close behind. Silence descended once more, broken only by the ragged sound of Declan's breathing. He stood, chest heaving, the pickaxe handle held ready, the adrenaline slowly draining away to be replaced by a cold dread. He had just broken his one rule. He had gotten involved. He turned to the woman. Her simple cotton dress was torn at the shoulder, a smudge of dust on her cheek, but her eyes held not just fear, but a flicker of awe. She spoke softly in Spanish. "Gracias, señor." He only understood the one word. He gave a curt nod, his throat too tight to speak. He saw a shallow gash on his forearm, already welling with blood from a lucky knife nick he hadn't even felt. Before he could wave it off, she was there, tearing a strip from her petticoat. Her touch was gentle, practiced. She pulled a small pouch from her satchel, sprinkled a fine green powder onto the wound, and wrapped it with a swift, efficient grace. The bleeding stopped almost instantly, a cool sensation seeping into his skin. He looked from his bandaged arm to her face. In her eyes he saw not a victim, but a strength that matched his own. A bond of shared violence and unexpected care had been forged between them in the dust. He knew he couldn't leave her there. Silas's threat hung in the air, venomous and real. With a grunt, he motioned with his head. "Come on," he said in English. "I'll see you to your home." She seemed to understand his intent, if not the words. She gave a small, hesitant nod. She led the way, and he followed, his pickaxe handle now held like a rifle, the ghost of his past now replaced by the very real threat of the future he had just created. They traveled for hours, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. He learned she was a healer, not from words, but from the way she would pause to inspect a plant, her fingers brushing its leaves with a familiar reverence. He learned of her gentleness from the way she offered him her water skin before drinking herself. Finally, as twilight began to paint the sky in hues of purple and orange, she led him to a place he never knew existed, a narrow cleft in the rocks hidden by a thicket of mesquite. It opened into a small, secluded valley where a handful of modest adobe homes were built around a small, life-giving spring. This was her community, a haven for the people the world had thrown away. An elderly woman with a face like a dried apple greeted her with a relieved cry in Spanish. Children peeked from behind doorways. An old prospector with a cough gave Declan a wary but not unkind nod. Here, in this hidden pocket of the world, was a peace Declan hadn't felt in years. Sitloli was their heart, and he had brought her back to them. The relief, however,
was a fragile, fleeting thing. Just as Sitloli turned to offer him a proper thank you, a new figure appeared at the mouth of the valley. He was tall and lean, moving with the predatory grace of a panther. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his bare chest crisscrossed with old scars. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. He was Apache, and his eyes, as black and hard as obsidian, fixed on Declan. He saw the white man standing beside his wife. He saw her torn dress and the unfamiliar bandage on Declan's arm. A chill snaked down Declan's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Sitloli's face went pale. She let out a soft cry. "Cale!" The warrior, Cale, did not look at her. His entire being was focused on Declan, a singular, terrifying intensity. The fragile peace of the valley shattered. He took a slow step forward, his hand never straying far from the knife at his hip. He looked at Declan not as a man, but as a thing to be removed. He spoke, and though Declan did not understand the Apache words, their meaning was as clear as a death sentence. Then Cale's lips twisted, and he forced out the only two English words he deemed necessary. "You die."
Sitlali stepped between the two men, her hands held up in a placating gesture. She spoke quickly in Apache, her voice a torrent of explanation, trying to build a bridge over the chasm of misunderstanding that had opened between them. Declan stood his ground, the pickaxe handle feeling suddenly inadequate. He didn't need to understand the language to read the scene. Cale's eyes were locked on him, his face a mask of cold fury. The warrior saw not a rescuer but a threat, another white man encroaching on his world, touching what was his. The torn dress, meant to be evidence of a struggle, was being interpreted as a sign of something far worse. Cale's gaze flickered to the bandage on Declan's arm, a strip torn from his wife's own clothing. He saw it not as proof of her care, but as a mark of intimacy, a binding tie that was a profound insult. His honor, a rigid and brutal code, demanded retribution. He cut Sitlali off with a sharp gesture, his eyes never leaving Declan's. The community watched from their doorways, a silent, fearful audience to the unfolding drama. They respected Cale as a protector, but they also feared his unbending nature. An old man, the prospector Declan had seen earlier, hobbled forward. "Cale, this man, he did a good thing. The coyotes had her." Cale ignored him. In his world, a man protected what was his. If he was not there to do it and another man stepped in, it was a challenge. He took another deliberate step. "The debt for touching my wife," he said, his English slow and deliberate now, heavy with menace, "is blood." Declan felt his own Irish temper begin to boil, a hot, familiar rage. He hadn't survived a collapsed mine, crossed a continent, and buried his soul in a dusty hole just to be killed for an act of decency. "I saved her life," he growled, his voice low. "You put your hands on her," Cale retorted, the accusation hanging in the still air. For him, the distinction was meaningless. The standoff was a powder keg, the fuse sizzling. But Sitlali, a bridge between worlds, refused to let it explode. She stepped in front of Cale again, this time placing her hands on his chest. It was a profound courage. He was a man few dared to touch in anger. She spoke again, her voice no longer pleading, but firm, imbued with the quiet authority she held as a healer. She pointed to the direction from which they came, reenacting the confrontation with Silas, her words painting a picture of the violence that had almost occurred. The elderly woman who had first greeted her now came forward, adding her voice, speaking of the terrors of men like Silas. The community began to murmur their support, a subtle but palpable force shifting behind her. Kael's rigid posture didn't change, but a flicker of doubt entered his eyes. He listened, his gaze shifting from his wife's earnest face to the silent, watching eyes of his community, and finally back to the stoic, defiant Irishman. He saw the gash on Declan's arm, the exhaustion in his posture, and the lack of fear in his eyes. It was not the look of a despoiler. It was the look of a fighter. He still saw a threat, an unwelcome intrusion, but the narrative he had constructed in his mind began to crumble. He grunted, a sound of reluctant concession, and took a single step back. He turned his back on Declan, a sign of ultimate dismissal, and walked towards his home, leaving Siplali standing in the center of the tense circle. The immediate threat of death had passed, replaced by something colder and more complicated. An uneasy truce, as thin as a spider's thread, had settled over the valley. Declan was offered a place to stay for the night, a small, clean room in the old prospector's adobe. He accepted, too wearied to make the trek back to his mind in the dark. He sat by the man's small fire, sharing a meal of beans and tough bread. The prospector, whose name was Jebediah, had a wisdom born of years spent watching the desert. "He's a proud man, Kael is. His world is one of sharp edges and clear lines. You smudged one of his lines today. He won't forget it." Declan nodded, understanding more than the old man knew. He, too, was a man of sharp edges, carved by grief. He had smudged his own line, the one that kept him isolated and safe from the pain of connection. As the night deepened, he couldn't sleep. He stepped outside. The desert air was cool, the sky a breathtaking spray of stars. He saw Sitlali standing by the spring, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. She spoke in halting English, words she had clearly struggled to piece together. "He is a good man. He protects." "I know," Declan replied, his voice softer than he intended. "But he does not understand. Your world." She gestured vaguely towards the darkness beyond the valley. "My world is between." In that moment, Declan saw her not just as a healer or a warrior's wife, but as a person caught in the same lonely space as himself, a place between a past that could not be changed and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain. A connection, silent and profound, passed between them. It was not romantic, it was deeper, a recognition of shared solitude, of two souls trying to navigate a world that had no clear place for them. The next morning, Kael was gone. He had left before dawn on a hunt, a silent departure that was both a reprieve and a warning. Sitlali came to Declan as he was preparing his mule. She handed him a small leather pouch. "For your journey," she said. Inside were dried herbs and a small, tightly wrapped package of venison jerky. It was a simple gift, but it carried a weight of gratitude that left him speechless. He met her eyes, and for a moment the chasm of language and culture disappeared. He simply nodded, a gesture of thanks that conveyed more than words ever could. He guided his mule out of the hidden valley, the memory of his brief time there a strange, warm stone in the pit of his stomach. He had stepped back into the world, and now the world was coming for him. 2 days later, as he was working his claim, a shadow fell over him. It was Silas. His arm was in a sling, but his eyes burned with a fresh, venomous hatred, and he wasn't alone. With him were 4 other men, each with the same hard, cruel look. They held rifles, their expressions confident and mocking.
We told you we'd finish this, Irish. Heard you got a taste for that healer. We thought we'd go pay her a visit after we're done with you. See if she can patch us up too. Declan's blood ran cold. The threat wasn't just against him. It was against Sitlali, against that small, hidden valley of peace. His careful, constructed wall of isolation, the one he had maintained for 5 long years, had not just been breached, it had been annihilated. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man standing between a fragile future and the brutal realities of the frontier. The weight of his pickaxe handle felt different in his hands now. It was no longer just a tool for his penance. It had become a weapon, and he was no longer just a miner. He was a protector. For the first time since his wife had died, Declan had something to lose, and he would not fail to save them.
He let out a savage yell and charged, not at Silas, but at the man closest to him. The sheer, unexpected ferocity of the attack caught them off guard. Before the man could even properly aim his rifle, Declan was on him, the heavy pickaxe handle swinging in a deadly arc. The impact sent the man down with a sickening thud. A shot rang out, kicking up dust by Declan's boot. He didn't stop. He used the fallen man's body as a shield, rolling and coming up inside the reach of the next bandit. He drove the end of the handle up into the man's jaw. Another shot splintered the rock behind him. He was operating on pure, desperate instinct, a cornered animal fighting for more than just his own life. He had seen what men like these did, and the image of Sitlali's calm, strong face propelled him forward. He disabled another man with a crippling blow to the knee. Now it was just Silas and one other. Silas, hampered by his broken arm, fumbled to aim his pistol. The last man charged with a knife. Declan met him, their grunts and curses echoing off the canyon walls. It was a clumsy, violent dance. A knife slash opened a deep cut on Declan's side. The pain, a hot, searing shock. But Declan's raw strength won out. He overpowered the man, and the knife was silenced. He turned, staggering, bleeding, to face Silas. Silas finally raised his pistol, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Now, Irish," he began. He never finished the sentence. A single arrow fletched in black sprouted from his chest. His eyes went wide with shock, the pistol falling from his nerveless fingers. He crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the dust. Declan looked up. Standing on the ridge silhouetted against the unforgiving blue sky was Cale. He held a bow in one hand, another arrow already knocked. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He looked down at the scene, his gaze taking in the bodies, the bleeding Irishman, and the dead man with his arrow in his chest. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the rocks. Declan, panting and bleeding, was left in the sudden, ringing silence. He didn't know if Cale had saved him or had simply been eliminating a common threat. The ambiguity of the act was a perfect reflection of the land itself, harsh, unpredictable, and owing no man any explanations. With a groan, he tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it tightly against the wound in his side. He knew he had to get back, not to his mine, not anymore. The journey was a blur of pain. He stumbled through the desert, leaning heavily on the pickaxe handle, his vision swimming. He followed the landmarks Jebediah had described, a dead saguaro here, a strange rock formation there. By the time he found the hidden cleft in the rocks, he was on the verge of collapse.
He stumbled into the small valley, his legs finally giving out. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Citlali's face, her eyes wide with alarm, running towards him. He woke to the smell of herbs and the soft touch of a cool cloth on his forehead. He was in Citlali's home, a small, clean adobe filled with bundles of drying plants. His wound had been expertly cleaned and stitched, a poultice of mashed leaves covering the angry red flesh. Citlali sat beside him, grinding something in a stone bowl, her expression a mixture of concern and a deep, quiet focus. He tried to sit up, a sharp jolt of pain making him gasp. "Easy," she said, her English still hesitant but clearer now. "You rest." Over the next few days, she nursed him back from the brink. She brought him broth and teas that soothed the pain and fought the fever. She rarely spoke, but her gentle presence was a constant comfort. In the quiet moments, he watched her, the way her hands moved with such certainty, the deep well of peace in her eyes. He learned that her strength was not in defiance, but in her unshakable commitment to healing, to mending what was broken. It was a strength he had never known. Jebediah visited, bringing news from the outside world. Silas and his gang were gone, their bodies discovered by prospectors. The territory was a little safer. "You did a good thing, son," the old man said, his eyes kind. "A hard thing, but a good thing." Declan knew the cost of that good thing was a debt he could never repay, a debt to a man who both hated and had saved him. One evening, Cale returned. He walked into the small adobe, his presence immediately filling the space with a familiar tension. He looked at Declan, lying on the pallet, then at his wife. He saw how she cared for the white man, the quiet intimacy of the sick room. But this time, his eyes saw something different. He saw the healing, not the injury. He saw his wife fulfilling her role as curandera, a role he deeply respected. He saw the cost of the white man's intervention, the fresh, angry wound in his side. He and Citlali spoke in low, quiet Apache. He couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the tone. It wasn't a fight. It was a counsel, a weighing of facts and feelings. Finally, Cale walked over to where Declan lay. He looked at him, his face still a stone mask, but the fire in his eyes had been banked. He held out his hand, not in friendship, but in something far more complex. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. "The blood debt," Cale said, his voice flat, "is paid." He meant the blood Declan had shed, the arrow he had fired, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. The rigid lines of his world had been redrawn to accommodate this strange new reality. With that, he turned and left, leaving the two of them in the quiet room. Declan knew it was not a welcome, it was a release. He was free to go. The next morning he was strong enough to stand. Citlali helped him to the door, her hand briefly on his arm to steady him. He looked out at the small, peaceful valley, then back at her. The gulf of culture, language, and experience between them was immense, and yet in that small, hidden place they had found a common ground, a quiet understanding built on shared danger and the simple, profound act of care. He said, "Thank you." The words felt small and inadequate for what she had done. She simply smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile. "Go with God," she whispered. He walked out of the valley, leaving the healer and her warrior husband to their life. He didn't look back. He no longer needed to. The ghost on his shoulders, the one that had haunted him for 5 long years, was gone. He still didn't know what the future held. The desert was still harsh. The world was still a dangerous place. But as he walked towards the rising sun, he was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had finally, against all odds, mended what was broken inside him. He was no longer just a miner searching for silver. He was Declan O'Malley, and he was, for the first time in a very long time, whole.